Hey, good afternoon, all. I'm happy to be here to start off the second, seminar in the series for the semester. This is the Health and the Public Interest Program, a master's program at Georgetown University that looks at social determinants of health, particularly with respect to health justice, health advocacy, and public health. We have a special seminar today by Judy Waxman coming up. She'll be introduced briefly, but I'm excited for this overview today on the history and where we are with respect to women's health efforts. It's been a long road, and it's certainly got a long way to go, as we'll see. But anyway, um, Emily Quinn, one of our students, is going to introduce Judy, and then Judy's going to give a talk, followed by questions from our students, which Emily will moderate, and then after that, questions from the more general audience. Emily, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Myers. And just a warm welcome to you, Judy. Thank you for taking the time to come speak with us. Just to give a brief introduction about our speaker today, Judy is one of the nation's leading healthcare law and policy analysts. She has more than 40 years of experience consulting with hundreds of state and national organizations working to improve the health of women and other vulnerable groups, and has worked as a senior staff leader in health and reproductive rights policy at the National Women's Law Center, Families USA, and the National Health Law Program. She also served as an adjunct professor at George Washington University's Milken School of Public Health for many years, teaching reproductive health and women's rights. She also specializes in the implementation of the ACA, particularly as it relates to women and other vulnerable consumers. In addition, she's a national expert on Medicaid law and its implementation and strategies for enhancing access to family planning services for all women, and in particular, low-income women. Now that she's retired, she's been able to pursue her lifelong love of history by becoming an oral historian. And her biggest project is interviewing people who were active in the second wave of the women's rights movement in the 1970s, herself included. She was on the board of the National Women's Party in the 2000s, and they have since donated the building to the National Park Service, where it is now used as a museum on women's history. So we really look forward to hearing your presentation today, Judy, and I can pass it over to you.
Great. Thank you for having me. I'm pleased to give you this history. So let's start at the beginning. Why do women try to control the number of children they have, try to control their fertility? Well, the reasons are varied, of course, but maybe they feel they're too young to have a child, or too old, or they have enough children, or they can't afford more children. Maybe it was an extramarital affair, or in the past, the astrological signs didn't line up, maybe. A lot of what has always been the case for women is still the same today. The first records that I heard about on different kinds of what I'll call abortifacients, that's methods for an abortion, were from a record of Chinese texts from 3000 BCE. A lot of the methods that were noted, of course, were things like ingesting potions and plants, that kind of thing. Is the slide presentation up? I don't see it.
I'll start it now.
Oh, okay. Yes. Sorry about that. Okay. There we go. Okay, let's go to the next slide then. Now, in ancient Greece, there was a plant called Siliphium, and you can see it kind of looked like a heart, which may have implications on how this kind of plant that controlled fertility was about your heart. And it was so popular that it ultimately became extinct. It was on a coin at one point, a picture of that. There are other kinds of methods Greeks and Egyptians used were things like barrier methods. They did come up with a kind of a condom. There were certainly inserting materials into the vagina like crocodile dung, jumping over snakes, and jumping up and down were popular kinds of methods. Now, what these women were trying to do was bring on the menses. It wasn't a clear scientific understanding at the time of, fertilization and what was happening to create the fetus. So if you could bring on the menses, the monthly menses, that would mean you were not pregnant. Next. This is a picture from the 1300s. You can see one woman is ministering to another. And what it was is another popular plant called pennyroyal tea, which actually is still used today. Next. I'm going to move to what is now we think of as the United States. Indigenous people I found documents of communities in California. And I'm going to do some of this as generalizations about that. But what a lot of these communities were concerned about was limiting their population and limiting it to certain times of the year. So there would be sexual restrictions, infanticide, ingesting various recipes of obviously plants and so forth, songs and rituals, and requiring abstinence. So if children were born, they would be born in the spring when there was actually a food supply. That was pretty popular. And in some communities, men played the role of wives, so they didn't have to worry about children coming. Next. Now we're talking about women in colonial times. What early legal and religious restrictions were there? Well, interestingly, there were none. There were no restrictions, really. All methods were probably acceptable. And the Spanish and the English, of course, brought their own customs and ideas. So the Catholic Pope actually did not forbid abortion until 1869. So in the colonial period, the Spanish that came and so forth did not have that belief to adhere to. The English recognized an ability, something they called quickening in the pregnant women. So what is that? That is when the woman could actually feel movement of the fetus. And that's when they thought, well, okay, life has begun at quickening. And that, of course, is a very wide range. It could be anything from 16 to 25 weeks when a woman first feels movement. By the way, the term of a pregnancy is thought to be 40 weeks, and it is time from the end of the last menstrual period, and 40 weeks forward is the so-called due date. Now, it was very popular for married women to have a manual with recipes on how to bring forth the menses. Again, no laws on the books, wasn't a crime, and it was really unregulated except maybe for a few exceptions. I'm going to read a quote from Roe v. Wade. Roe says, or I should say Justice Blackmun said, that abortion was probably legal all the way through pregnancy. At the time of the Constitution was written and throughout the major part of the 18th century, a woman enjoyed substantially broader right to terminate a pregnancy than she does in most states now, at least with respect to the early stages of pregnancy and very possibly without limitation. The fertility rate in 1800 was 7. So what's the fertility rate? That's the average number of children a woman would have. Now, of course, this freedom was not true for enslaved people. Owners, as I'm sure you all know, had control over their property, rapes, coercion, wanted more babies, sell them for money. Obviously a very different situation. Do want to read another quote from 1820. I know of no era more consuming to a state, that of stocking farms with men almost exclusively. I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man on the farm, while what she produces is an addition to the capital, while his labor disappears in mere consumption. And that was Thomas Jefferson. Next slide. Okay, moving on into the 1800s. This is from 1820. This was an ad in a New York City newspaper from a woman, Madame Restell. If you're interested, I actually just read a whole book about this woman. So you can see the parts that are red. She specializes in safe and immediate removal of all special irregularities and obstructions in females. I mean, you need to know what you were looking for, but people like Madame Restell definitely provided potions and abortions and other things for married ladies who had, quote, irregularities. Also, I found out in this book that I read that one of the, I'll say, chemicals she used was the same as the second drug we use now, misoprostol, it's about, and we will talk about medication abortion, but it was the same thing, which is really quite astounding. So what happened? Why there's all this freedom here? And so what happened? Well, beginning in the 1800s, a couple of states started to put prohibitions on abortion. And what really changed was right after the Civil War, the American Medical Association was started. And these men thought, we're the professionals. We have to promote ourselves, and we don't want these midwives, healers, whatever, to be doing our jobs. And maybe what we should do is just get abortion banned. And that way they would lose a lot of their business. Maybe some totally go out of business. And that would really move us forward as the real practitioners, not those particular people. And in fact, by 1890, 40 states had prohibited abortion, and by 1910, it was all. But contraception continued. Goodyear, the tire company, made rubber condoms. I don't know if you ever heard the expression, but sometimes they were called rubbers, and that's because the Goodyear company made them. As always, from the past and to today, if you have money and resources and knowledge, then you know how to get the services you need. Now, social attitudes were starting to change, and there started to be this belief that people called the social purity of women. Contraception and abortion was demeaning to women because their role, of course, was to have children. Next slide. So along comes the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. This was an organization that was started as an anti-obscenity group by a devout Christian whose name you may have heard recently, Anthony Comstock. He was actually, well, he was a zealot, no question about that, He also headed up the U.S. Postal Office. He was an inspector. And he was able to work with members of Congress and got a law passed that banned the mailing, for one thing, of, and I'm going to read this, obscene, lewd, or lascivious, and every filthy book, pamphlet, picture, paper, letter, writing, print, or other publication of indecent character, and every article that's designed, adapted, or intended to prevent conception or producing abortion shall not be conveyed through the mails or delivered from any post office or any letter carrier. So the mailing of anything that the law called lascivious or lewd or dirty included contraception and abortifacients. And in fact, he went after Madame Brastel, posed as somebody needing her product, and then brought the police with him. She was jailed. She ultimately killed herself. He also got Margaret Sanger involved in jail, which we will talk about her. And that law is still on the books, actually, not the contraception part, but the abortion part. Next slide. Here we are later in 1894. Dr. Mott's pennyroyal female tea, as I said, pennyroyal teas remain popular and are still used today. And there's a caution here. Care should be taken not to use them in pregnancy. They be sure to cause a miscarriage. Oh, okay. Signal for that. Thank you. Now, in the early 19th centuries, again, there were some new attitudes rising, and there was a fear of race suicide. I say that in quotes. The theory that the genetics and natural selection will lead to poverty. So poverty's hereditary, and what we have to do in this country is promote Northern Europeans, but not Southern Europeans, certainly not Jews, Chinese, or Negroes. And so in 1907, there was the first law in Indiana was passed, which would require sterilization of dependent, diseased, or anyone incapable of regulating their own reproductive abilities. Now, who do we think that was supposed to apply to? All those unwanted people. And interestingly, by 1927, there was a Supreme Court that upheld 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. That was a very famous quote. It upheld forced sterilization. Now, some women advocates, I'll call them, were concerned about this. You may have heard of Emma Goldman. She was a socialist, and now I'm going to talk about Margaret Sanger. So Margaret Sanger's mother had 11 children, many miscarriages, had an early death. And Margaret Sanger wrote a pamphlet called What Every Girl Should Know, starting to give information about what is really happening with your fertility and pregnancy and so forth. Now, at 1900, the fertility rate was 3.5. I should say that replacement rate, in other words, to keep the same number of people in the population, you need a fertility rate of 2.1. So we've gone down from 7 to 3.5, still producing many more people. Next slide.
Hey, Judy, just to jump in quickly, I think your camera fell down, so we can kind of.
Oh, I see. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem.
Is that better? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I'll try to move along here. So this is an ad. I actually copied this. I took a picture of it in a museum. Margaret Sanger started in 1917. She opened this clinic to teach women about their bodies. So can you afford to have a large family? Do you want any more children? If not, why do you have them? Do not kill, do not take life. She was opposed to abortion, but prevent safe, harmless information on how to control yourself. And you can see it's written in English, Yiddish, and Italian, because this was the Brooklyn neighborhood that she lived in and where she opened, she actually opened the clinic. She called her group the American Birth Control League. Next slide. And she started the Birth Control Review. You can see this is from 1923. Oh, you can't really see what it says, but you can get the picture of the woman with the ball and chain and unwanted babies. We'll go to the next slide. Now, there were obviously campaigns against her. As I told you, Anthony Comstock got her in jail at some point. And in 1930 now, one of her clinic doctors ordered diaphragms. That's what this is. It's actually also a rubber device. It's inserted in the vagina and it protects the cervix from getting any sperm on it. So the package came, it was called One Package, and from Japan, and it was seized at the port. And she thought, the way to get help on this is now to get the doctors involved. Like, they're recommending this to some people. Let's get them on my side. And it actually worked because they got to court and the decision was, this is not the Supreme Court, this is the Second Circuit, which is like the New York area and some mid-Atlantic. And it's like they concluded that if a doctor believes contraception is in the best interest of the patient, then okay, it can be prescribed and used. This new decision did not apply to the whole country. But in fact, it is when our DC Planned Parenthood opened. I should also say, in the 1942, I think it was, people changed the name from the Birth Control League to Planned Parenthood, which actually Margaret Sanger hated, but that's what we got. Okay, next. Now we're in the 1940s, and again, you can see that the ad, beware of one intimate neglect that can engulf you in marital grief. It was rumored then that oh, wait, I'm not sure on the right page. Oh, yeah. What I wanted to say here is that the National Council of Negro Women was the first national women's organization to officially adopt a right for women to have contraception. So they broke with popular opinion, interestingly. Okay. And in this case, what it talks about is there was a belief that Coca-Cola had spermicide in it. And so I don't know if you know what the bottle looked like, but it kind of was round on the bottom and came up at the top in a little part. And there was the shake and shoot method. So women would shake the bottle and shoot up into themselves the Coca-Cola as a way to possibly have a spermicide. Okay. The other thing that was going on, go next slide. So another thing that was happening is that Margaret Sanger had this dream that all women should be able to take a magic pill and be able to prevent pregnancy with it. And she was friendly with a woman, a very wealthy woman, and she also knew some doctors, actually Catholic doctors, that were doing research on infertility, and she got them all together. They did experiments in Puerto Rico and produced the pill, which was approved in this country in 1960. Around this time, too, another population crisis was identified. There were too many people in this country, zero population growth. it was called, and experts said, the world doesn't have the resources. We can't focus, we can't feed everybody. We got to figure out ways to provide family planning for women. And also in the 60s in the United States, the poverty program that came from the Office of Economic Opportunity did start to provide funds to clinics that could give low income women access to this birth control. Another focus of the 60s was that, and I kind of remember this, a woman in Arizona who was a TV personality, she was a kindergarten teacher. She had already had 4 children. This was her 5th pregnancy. She was very sick at the beginning, and her husband went to Europe and brought back this nausea medicine, which turned out to be something called thalidomide. It was determined that thalidomide caused serious birth defects in the fetus. And she went to the hospital to get an abortion. At that time, where she lived in Arizona, you had to go through a panel of doctors to get approved. First, they said okay, but then she talked about it to warn women, and then they said no. She wound up going to Sweden to get her abortion, and but it was so widely publicized that some states like Colorado and California and a bunch of others started to loosen up those abortion restrictions. Now, going back to the one package case, in 1965, it was still not legal to distribute in Connecticut. So a woman named Estelle Griswold was head of Planned Parenthood in New Haven, Connecticut. She tried to change the law in the state. It didn't work. She finally sued the state. And in 1965, the Supreme Court said, okay, contraception for married women, is okay. And it took until 1972 for that same right to be extended to all women. Next slide. Of course, the 70s brought lots of protests, people demanding, women mostly demanding change. And that did start to get other states to make changes. Of course, before it was legal, women did illegal things. I don't know if you've heard of the Jane Project, which came out of Chicago, where women had a whole network to help other women find somebody to do the abortion for them. There was feminist health centers started that women taught other women how to do abortions. Next one. Okay, this is me. I just threw this in for fun. I have 2 children who are 17 years apart, as you can see, and this is one of our marches. Okay, next slide. In the 70s, obviously, lots of activity happened. More funds for low-income people. Medicaid added family planning services as a required service, a lot of public support. However, and I'm jumping ahead slightly to 1965, what happened, 1975, an amendment was introduced in Congress called the Hyde Amendment. What that said was that the federal government would not pay for abortion. So Medicaid, even though almost all states covered it at the time, with no federal money, most states wouldn't pay. About 17 states now pay with their own money for that. There was, interestingly, from a political point of view, I think, support for liberalization of abortion laws. And it was really more on the Republican side than the Democratic side, because the Republicans were, like, at the time, the wealthier, WASPy people, I'll call them. And the Democrats were more working class people. And President Nixon was persuaded to oppose decriminalization of abortion because the theory was you'll break up that old, what they called Roosevelt coalition of Democrats and get the Catholics over on the Republican side. And so it's a totally political decision. And in fact, that's what happened. And I use the example of President Reagan, who voted to liberalize as governor of California, but then when he ran for president was like, oh, no, we're against that. Totally political. Okay, so the two big cases that I want to discuss, you've all heard about Roe v. Wade, of course. It was a challenge to Texas restrictions. Roe was not the woman's name. And in 1973, the Supreme Court said that, again, as I mentioned in the beginning of our country, women had a broader right to terminate their pregnancy. And in fact, there are 3 trimesters of a pregnancy. So in the first trimester, doctor decides totally. In the second trimester, there can be restrictions as long as they're for the woman's health, and then no abortions in the third trimester. The decision was based on privacy and liberty that was from the Constitution. And of course, deaths of women who tried to get abortions went down. And then states start adding restrictions. Okay, it allows restrictions in a certain period. So things like no services in public hospitals. You can come in and ask for an abortion, but you have to wait 48 hours and then come back for it. There needs to be parental consent, for women under 18, 21, whatever. Spousal consent. We need this consent of your spouse. Many restrictions start happening. So that's what the second case is. Planned Parenthood of Southeast Pennsylvania versus Casey, who was governor and the father of our current Senator Casey. And that case said it changed sort of the theory. It was like, well, no longer there's 3 trimesters. We won't do that. We'll say a state can have a restriction as long as it doesn't it doesn't create an undue burden on the woman. Well, what's an undue burden? Obviously, in the eye of the beholder. I mean, I personally think having to come back 48 hours later, who knows what's going on in that woman's life? And that to me would be an undue burden. But in fact, every restriction was upheld except one, and that was spousal consent. And that's because the one woman on the court said no, she wouldn't go that far. But everything else was upheld. So next slide. This is actually a picture of my T-shirt from the time. We said that we were very worried that opening in a state legislature near you, there's going to be the incredible shrinking women's right to choose. And she thought it was her body. That's Justice Rehnquist in the middle. It was really like, oh my gosh, now all the states are going to do more and more restrictions. And it did happen, not immediately, but it did happen. Next slide. Sister Song, I wanted to put this in here because women of color groups in the 90s decided to get together and create a new organization. And their point was, yes, we need the right to abortion, but we also we need the right to good prenatal care. That reproductive justice is a broader concept than just preventing pregnancy. We need our children to be safe in our communities. And this organization has really picked up steam. Next slide. Of course, science has moved on. And at the bottom of this, you see some of the older kinds of contraceptions. I see the diaphragm on there. Going up, there's the pill, patch, and then, of course, some that work really, really well. The IUD, which stands for what does it say? Internal uterine device, something like that. Close. Anyway, science continues to create new kinds of contraception, which obviously is helpful. Next slide. Now, I wanted to raise this because the abortion pill or medication abortions is actually two pills. I mentioned one. The first one's called mifepristone, and a woman would take that and then between 24 to 48 hours, take the second pill, which is the one I mentioned that was being used in the 1800s. So it was approved in 2000 by the United States, also approved almost all over the world as safe and effective. But as you can see by this chart, getting up to 2020, this is the major way women get abortions now. Now, it said that it works up to 10 weeks, but I know I'm involved with our Planned Parenthood in this country, and it does work to 12 weeks for sure. I know we do that. So once we got to 2000, the fertility rate is now down to 2, slightly under what would be replacement rate. Okay, next. And when do abortions occur? This is a little bit old, but it's pretty accurate. As you can see, at 10 weeks, there's like 80%. Pardon me, when you get to 12 weeks, it's about 88%. So really, almost 90% happen in the early stages. And then above that, it looks like it's about 11 or 12% happen after 13 weeks. You hear all kinds of bands at 6 weeks, 10 weeks, 15 weeks, all kinds of things like that are happening. Okay, next. I want to put this up here about the Affordable Care Act because my group, I was with the National Women's Law Center then, and we did a lot of work on this. So now insurance companies must cover maternity care, which they didn't before because of this law. Birth control is considered a preventive service, and it needs to be provided by insurance companies without a copay, meaning you go and you get it covers the whole thing. Now, abortion was a big debate, as you can imagine. There was lots of push to have it prohibited, and that did not happen. Now it is up to the insurance company as to whether or not they want to cover it. Some do, some don't. Some states say they have to. Anyway, that was a kind of a win to say it's not prohibited. Next slide. Now, in 2010, Republicans took over the majority of state legislatures. This only goes up to 2021, but I wanted to show you what was happening. So, okay, we can add restrictions, so that's what we're going to do. More and more restrictions on clinics, longer waiting periods, requirement for counseling. A doctor who does an abortion has to have an admitting privilege at the hospital, even if they don't go to the hospital. A ban on certain contraceptions, all sorts of things got put into place. A 20-week ban, a 16-week ban, a 6-week ban, and of course, many restrictions on medication abortions. 19 states would prohibit drugs going through the mail or through telemedicine. Now, there were positive changes too, as you can see, the green line, and there are more now, affirming the right to abortion, allowing a nurse practitioner to provide the abortion, requiring Medicaid to cover abortion, and many other things. But you can see the restrictions are outweighing the positive things. Next slide. Okay, Trump is elected. Now, Justice Kennedy was the deciding vote on that Casey case. He wasn't really sure what to do. And he had a chat with Justice Blackmun, who was still in the court. He's the one that wrote Roe. And so he's like, okay, as long as we let them have some restrictions. So he was the pivotal person. He was replaced by Justice Kavanaugh by Trump, and Kavanaugh is a very conservative Catholic opposed to abortion. Of course, there were other replacements too. Trump got to appoint 3 people. Justice Gorsuch, very conservative, replaced Scalia, who himself was very conservative. And then when Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, she was replaced by Amy Coney Barrett, a very conservative person. Next slide. Okay, before we get to this, I should say that the Trump administration tried to eviscerate the contraception laws and regulations that were in the Affordable Care Act. They did do significant damage, but in fact, they were overturned when Biden got back into office. Now, this is the Jackson Women's Health Organization, and it's in Texas, and Texas had put into place a 15-week ban. So it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, of course, under Roe, that couldn't stand. But in June of 2022, the Supreme Court changed its mind and said, oh, there's no such thing as liberty or privacy in the Constitution. States can do whatever they want. They want to do 15-week ban, okay? They want to ban it totally, okay? We are totally overturning Roe v. Wade. It's up to the people, they said, but they meant the people in each state, or really the legislatures in each state. Next slide. I put this up here because this is actually a picture from around the Civil War, the Texas vigilantes. And Texas has done some amazing things. They even started before the Dobbs case, where if a person aids or abets somebody else to get an abortion, that means gives them money, drives them there, whatever, that is a crime, and there's a huge fine. And I've seen documents where people say, oh, I did really well this year. You know, I got 25 fines from all these people I know were driving. Now Texas is doing things like communities saying you can't drive in my street if you're going to an abortion. I don't know how that's enforced, but they, in fact, that's what they're doing. Okay, next slide. Now, this is confusing, I know, but since June of 2022, this is the latest. By the way, it constantly changes, and the Guttmacher Institute you see up there keeps it up to date. This is actually an interactive map, and if you want to know what's going on in your state, go to this website and you just click on your state, and it gives you all the details. So the dark colors are restrictive. So all these like burgundy colors, dark orange, dark yellow are restrictive. The blue ones are the more protective ones, and you can see for yourself how that balances out. There's about 14 states that have near total bans, but there's a whole lot of litigation going on in all, not all, but many of these states. So some are on hold, they're jumping up and back. I wasn't sure how I was going to really update this presentation because it really, pardon me, changes all the time. But we're more on the negative side than the positive side. And in fact, I've seen numbers about like some huge percentage of women are traveling. I mean, particularly out of the Deep South, to get an abortion. So it's expensive and it's hard to do. I should also mention here that over the last 30 years or so, about 60 countries have liberalized access to abortion, and only 4 have restricted or limited, and they are Nicaragua, El Salvador, Poland, and the United States. One of the big things that is, of course, is happening now is there is a lawsuit that's going to the Supreme Court. The argument's going to be March 26th about whether or not those abortion drugs I mentioned, the medication abortion, can be sent through the mail. Basically, the FDA approved the drugs in 2000. And during COVID, they looked at all their records, like, it's safe. You don't have to come, this that FDA said, you don't have to come into the doctor's office to get it anymore. Telemedicine, sending through the mail is fine. So this lawsuit is, 1, it shouldn't have been approved in the first place. 2, it cannot be sent through the mail. So basically, the opponents of this are asking for the Supreme Court to overturn the FDA's rules, which interestingly, the drug companies are up in arms. If they overturn this, what are they going to do about other stuff? But I want to make a point that the Comstock law is still on the books, not about contraception, but about abortion. So is that going to play into that? I don't know. We shall see. There's another case before the Supreme Court, which I'll get to, but let's move on. It's the autonomy, stupid. I don't know how many of you know this, but during the Clinton years, his phrase was, it's the economy, stupid. So this cartoon is illustrating that in last year's elections, there were 6 states when the public actually voted on a referendum or for a anti-choice, against an anti-choice, or for a pro-choice governor, 6 wins out of 6. So it's the autonomy, stupid, saying to the Republicans. And in some conservative states, Kansas, Kentucky, Ohio, which is seen as sort of purple. I do want to mention that there's lots of places women can get help. There's a national network of abortion funds that provides money for transportation, money for housing, money for the abortion. Certainly Planned Parenthood is very involved in creating ways to help people. And check out Plan C. We know Plan B is the morning after pill. Plan C is a website that gives information on every single state and how you can get help. Next slide. Okay, this is about public opinion. So starting in, this is 95, and I've seen it go all the way back to 73. The question was, as you can see, should abortion be legal in all or most cases or illegal in all or most cases? And it's consistently been legal in all or most, whoops, go back, legal in all or most cases. 61% to 37% in 2022. This is before the Dobbs case came down in June. Now, I want you to think about something for a minute. As I mentioned, when there's a referendum, something in the state now, invariably, in fact, in all the cases that I know of, the pro-choice faction won. There was a recent Washington Post ABC poll that asked the question, should abortion be a decision between the woman and her doctor? What do you think the percentage of people were that said yes? Think about it for a second. 78%. Wow, I don't know of any other political issue that winds up being so lopsided. 78% of the public is for women having the chance, the freedom to control their own bodies. So there's a lot of work to do still. I wanted to spend a minute on who gets an abortion. So first of all, the predictions are that in the United States, about a quarter of all women will have an abortion in their lifetime. Women of all ages, all religions. Mostly, the majority are in their 20s. Almost 60% already have a child, which is why I said traveling and all that can be really difficult. All races, all religions. 24% of people who had abortions, this is a couple years ago, the statistics, 2018, 24% were Catholic, and 25% of the American public is Catholic. So it's really everybody is doing it. I think a most telling statistic is that half of the women who've had abortions have income under the national poverty line. So what is that? So for a family of two, that's $20,000 a year. It's a lot of low income people. It makes sense. Why do women have abortions? Can't afford it. Have too many children, too old, too young. It's really the same. The fertility rate in 2000 in the United States was 1.6. So we are now below replacement rate significantly. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is a picture from the October 2021 March. And to me, it says we will prevail. There's a lot of work still to do to make sure women all over the country, all over the world, can have the freedom to control their own bodies. But as we said, the issues are really the same. What's the role of women in society? What are the politics? And really, bottom line, who controls? So we know women will do whatever it takes to carry out their own personal decisions. We just hope it's safe and that there is hope for the future. Okay, questions?
Okay, so we will turn it over to Emily to moderate the questions. I just want to stick in a quick announcement for students. Remember that you had a discussion post due today at before the seminar. So if you haven't done that, please go ahead and do it. And secondly, you have by the end of the day a survey due related to an upcoming seminar, which will only take you 4 or 5 minutes to do. So Emily.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for that informative presentation, Judy. I will open it up to HAPI students first, and I'll let you all have a second to collect your thoughts. A lot of information thrown at us there, but I can start off with a question, just recognizing your long history of work in this arena, Judy, and also noticing that from your conversation that it really is, for some people, it might be a moral issue, especially when it comes to abortion, but it seems it is more political than anything. Through your work, did you get the sense that the overturning of Roe v. Wade was coming, or what was that kind of like in your more professional experience? Was it like a shock, or you could kind of see it coming down the pipeline with them inching to make changes as things were going on?
Well, the reason, that's why I pointed out the Trump appointments to the Supreme Court, because knowing the views of the new members was very scary. So I still was a shock, I guess. I couldn't believe it really happened. But upon intellectually thinking about it, well, yeah, I can see how it happened. But of course, I am very encouraged by what is happening all over the country. in all of these votes that I mentioned. And I have a friend who had talked to a political consultant, and she was told that this person said, well, we didn't really want Roe v. Wade overturned because it really helped us get votes. Well, they did it. So hopefully the tide is turned.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Anybody else have any questions? Yes, Bonnie.
Thank you. I just, this is a comment really, and in the early 80s, I was doing a bunch of work with lay midwives, and I had occasion to look at many herbal manuals, and of course there are lots of plant-based abortifacients, but I noticed at that time that the word abortifacient appeared in almost no index of any book of herbal. So you could read through the book, and much in the same way as you pointed out with that ad for pennyroyal tea, you could discover for yourself. You could figure it out because it would say should not be taken during pregnancy. Might cause a miscarriage. Okay, got it. But you'd have to look through the whole book, and I looked at many, many, many volumes. And I don't think that it still is an index category, which is fascinating to me because it means that the index is a rhetorical device and not just information about what's in the book.
Well, there has been a movement, groups call it a speak out, where asking to women to talk about their experience, to talk about that they had an abortion, let it be known this is not an isolated incident. As I said, that about a quarter of the women in this country will have an abortion. And I have a friend who had a t-shirt that said, everybody loves someone who had an abortion. Well, let's know who they are. Don't be
That's
ashamed.
good. Yeah.
Okay.
That'll be good.
I'll pass it over to Kandai.
Hi, Judy. Thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering with how US foreign policy works and how that affects other countries such as the global gag rule. I was wondering with the upcoming election, do you think that more countries will, restrict abortion to receive more aid from the US? And how do you think how can we prepare actually to mitigate that effect? Because it's not just women's health that is then affected by stuff like the gag rule, but it's also other diseases and other preventable efforts that other NGOs are trying to stop.
Right. Well, that's a great question. And I am not an expert in that area. So I kind of have a simple answer, which is vote. And tell everybody that thinks like you to vote, because that is what will ultimately help us get rid of some of these crazy policies.
And now I'll call on Margot.
Hi, thank you for coming and speaking with us. This is a wonderful presentation. I'm just curious. I feel like a lot of the arguments that we hear against abortion right now are those religious and moral arguments. And I was wondering, at what point in time did that happen? Was it when it was mostly realized that abortion is safe, or was that something that's always been in the background at some point? I was just wondering, like, when the conversation changed to like be more religious and moral.
Yeah, I mean, that also is a great question that I can't totally answer, but obviously some people have religious beliefs that are sincere. I like to say, I don't have that particular belief, so you can have it, but I don't want you imposing your religious belief on me. But I would say in the 70s, I would guess that when I mentioned that, when Nixon realized he might be able to get the Catholics away from the Democrats and break up that coalition, that those kind of strains of argument started happening more and more.
That makes sense. Thank you.
And now I'll call in Dina.
Hi, I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question without sounding like an idiot, but and I'm no lawyer, but if a miracle happened and the Supreme Court did shift to a more liberal Supreme Court, is there any bringing Roe v. Wade back or a law that's similar to Roe v. Wade on a national level and taking that from the states and back into the national law?
Well, yes, of course there is. We evolve our laws as a country. So there's a couple of things that can happen. One is Congress could pass and a president sign a new law. And lots of people are talking about that, do it on a federal level. The technical problem with that is that the Senate has what we call a filibuster, which means you need 60 votes to get a controversial bill out of the Senate. So at least in the near future, that doesn't seem likely to pass a new law either, I would say, to reaffirm the right to abortion or restrict it totally. You will hear politicians saying that's what they want to do. But I would say, of course, I'm prejudiced for sure, but I think the Dobbs decision was very flawed, and that it could be overturned again should there be the right justices. For example, briefly, Justice Alito wrote it, and he said, oh, the law of the land was to restrict abortion. Well, like, no, it wasn't. There weren't laws. There were like what we call treatises, intellectuals writing about the law. Well, maybe they said that abortion was illegal some places, but there weren't any laws. So I think that certainly a new court could bring us back. And I do want to say, when you said restore Roe, just to mention that there's a debate within the advocacy community. Restoring Roe would also bring back a lot of restrictions because they're allowed, unless again a court changes that. There is a movement to have a quote I'll call cleaner bill. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, the Women's Health Protection Act, which would say no, women can have abortions and you can't have all those waiting periods, parental consent, blah, blah, blah. It's sort of cleaner. So there's that debate going on too. Do we want to restore Roe, which at this point almost feels like a halfway point, or do we really want women to have the right to control their bodies?
Thank you.
Anybody else have any additional questions for Judy?
Well, if not, I'm going to mention one other case that's coming up in April.
Definitely.
Yeah, there's the mifepristone case, which is being argued in March. That's the medication abortion. There's another one you may hear about, and that is there's a statute that got passed in the 80s that said if a hospital takes Medicare patients, then they have to serve everybody that comes to the emergency room. I mean, I was actually part of this at the time because I worked for legal services, and we had many clients around the country who were turned away from emergency rooms because they didn't have insurance. But now the hospital has to take somebody in an emergency situation, stabilize them, and then they can transfer them if they want. And they define in the statute emergency as acute symptoms, including pain, that could reasonably result in severe injury, bodily injury to an individual or organ. That's generally what it says. Well, here we go again with Texas, but also Idaho is saying, well, in the case of abortion, our definition is the woman has to be facing imminent death, which is obviously a much stricter definition than the federal law. And so that question is going to the Supreme Court also. And will this court say, okay, the state law can override federal law and you can decide whatever you want is an emergency? Or will they say, that's not our definition? That's if the person is going to suffer. There's this case in Texas where the woman was pregnant woman, third child, really wanted another baby, and diagnosed that the fetus was not going to make it. It had various anomalies. And also that if she didn't have an abortion, her own health would be in serious jeopardy. Maybe even she might lose fertility and not be able to have another child. But of course, in Texas, they said, we're not treating you. We're not giving you an abortion. It's against our law. So she was able, she had resources, she was able to go to another state. But you'll hear about that case coming up in April.
Hi, Judy. I'm not a student in the seminar, but I did have a question about the Idaho case. Was this filed right after President Biden issued his executive order to hospitals that they had to prescribe medication abortion to patients in active labor presenting to the emergency room?
Well, it wasn't, as my understanding, it wasn't necessarily give them medication abortion, but just abortion. And yes, the United States sued Iowa because they wouldn't do it. So the case is actually now Idaho versus the US, if you want to look it up.
Thanks.
And the Biden did put out, I mean, the administration put out a very clear memo on what emergency is. So we'll see what this court does.
Thanks.
Oh, do you have a question, Jasmine?
Yes, sorry, I forgot how to put the little hand up.
Okay, no worries.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. My question is if there's a way to like move the conversation from abortion access to being one of you know, political and religious, like moral question to a focus on access to healthcare, like seeing this as this is a healthcare problem and issue, and like a way to move that towards a healthcare conversation. I know that like some politicians and organizations that believe in like the privacy clause of like this is a healthcare issue, so it's a private issue, has been like one way to like maneuver and like push the conversation to healthcare access. But just from your work, is there like a better way to do that? I know that's a big question, but I'm curious on your thoughts.
Hey, all thoughts and ideas are welcome on how to move this along. I think that's a good one. There is sort of polling has kind of told advocates that saying pro-choice is not as effective as saying this is a woman's freedom. We're talking about freedom here, and that seems to get over better. So yes, I mean, I obviously think this is healthcare, and that argument has been made. Maybe it doesn't catch on as well as this is about freedom. And in fact, I saw some article where some anti-choice leader said, anti-abortion leader, I said, they stole freedom. I was like, oh, okay. I didn't know it was yours. Anyway, whatever works. And I think that's a good one.
That was a great question, Jasmine. I think that's about all the time we have for today, but thank you for a really thoughtful discussion and taking us through the history and also getting your thoughts from having been on the front lines of how all of this has unfolded up until today, Judy.
Happy to do it. Thank you for asking me.
And thank you, Judy, and we'll look forward to seeing you all next week for another great seminar. We have several coming up, so stay tuned. Bye, all.
Bye all.